We know this upcoming election will be about turnout. Both campaigns are scrambling to register voters and get them to the ballot box come November. Oddly enough, the policies we just discussed could be crucial in that effort for the Trump campaign. Joining us now to break down that issue is Jennifer Franco, an anchor and reporter here at One America News. Jennifer, when we look at the idea of social justice reform, it's a broad issue, but right now we're seeing it in the likes of police reforms, things such as that nature. We saw the president take some action. We see Joe Biden campaigning on the promise of some action. What really differentiates those two policies?
Yeah, so what's interesting going into this election, Alex, is the fact that the topic of criminal justice in our country had sort of not been blowing up as much as it has been leading into November. It's a topic that candidates, for the most part, avoided if you look at previous elections. But both President Trump and Joe Biden are now really digging their heels into this issue, especially because we're seeing what's happening in the country right now, like you mentioned, calls to defund police, social justice reform protests, and with those calls comes calls for criminal justice reform as well. So you have to look at the policies that both of these candidates, the incumbent, of course, and the potential challenger are proposing as we get closer to the general. And what's interesting is there is a lot of overlap if you look at the policy in general. So the president has been pushing for changes to mandatory minimum sentences at the federal level, commutations, things like that. Joe Biden's also proposing to work with Congress if he's elected to get the things done. But what differentiates the two is that President Trump's actually getting a lot of this done through the First Step Act that he worked with Congress to get passed. And so a lot of Joe Biden's critics are saying Joe Biden's talking about wanting to do a lot of these things, but the president's actually doing them. And if you go and look at the record of both of these two, Biden's record is something he's been defending and will have to continue defending the closer we get to November, because a lot of the bills that he pushed and helped craft in the 80s and the 90s, like the 1994 criminal justice bill, actually were part of the reason why we have the world's largest number of incarceration in the world. Like I said, at 1.5 million people are currently in our jail system. That's according to the latest data from 2018. That was the last time it was recorded. But Biden gets blamed a lot of the time by his critics for that, for the reason that, minorities, African Americans are at the top of that list when you look at who's in our prison system. So that's something the president's really been working on. And it's only going to get louder, this conversation, the closer we get to November.
Right, and a lot of activists say that the 1994 crime bill was just another furtherance, I should say, of what started really as far back as the 1950s. Of course, the war on drugs that really was escalated by Nixon, then Reagan, something of a continuation of that policy. And then we get to President Trump, and it's something that's a little bit of a complete shift within the Republican Party. We see that effort to allow some nonviolent prisoners out back into society, giving them a second chance of life, if you will. And that's something that seems to be popular among a lot of Americans, not only just Republicans, not only just Democrats, but independents as well, who don't believe that people who are in there for marijuana charges, for example, should be put in jail. So how is this message now resonating among voters going to November?
Yeah, and Alex, and going back to the point you made about marijuana, I mean, Joe Biden was one of the people that led the charge to make it easier for people to get put in jail for marijuana. So that's something a lot of people haven't forgotten about. So, and especially voters have not forgotten about this. So you have to take a look at what's going to get people out to the polls in November. And a lot of what the president and Biden have been doing is trying to connect with voters. Essentially, a lot of these efforts have been stifled because of the pandemic. As we've seen, the president's been he was forced for a while to really put a stop to those famous rallies that he holds or did hold leading up to 2016. He did restart them again, like we saw, but then we've heard that his campaign's scrapping plans to hold one in Alabama in the next week or so, like planned. But the president and his campaign are still looking into other means of doing digital town halls, and they have been doing other events and speaking and making sure they're connecting with the voters. Biden's been doing this as well, but it's been a little bit different, because you do have to remember, like we've talked about before, the president has not been campaigning, whereas Biden has been, and he still hasn't necessarily been getting the sort of response per se. You can look at the snapshot as far as the polls and the fundraising numbers go, But when it comes down to it, it's President Trump and his campaign who say that right now Biden's the one who's hiding. He's not the one doing anything to tackle any of the issues that the country is going through right now. And ultimately, this is all going to come out when the general election debates take place. Right now, there's only 3 scheduled so far, so it's 1 less than 2016. President Trump's been pushing for more. He says he wants to go toe-to-toe with Biden. Biden seems a little hesitant. His campaign's only agreed to 3. And so a lot of Biden supporters are hoping to see him kind of go back to his days like we saw in 2012 when he went up against Paul Ryan during the vice presidential debate, where he was a different person essentially on the debate stage. He was praised for it. He was called sharp by his supporters. He was on it. It's quite the different picture as what we saw during his primary debate performance, where he was almost lost in the shadows a lot of the times. It wasn't very memorable, and the things that do stand out were a lot of gaffes.
No, and that's something, too, that he's still trying to kind of overcome right now, and it's something that even the Biden campaign will say that they're trying to necessarily suppress that a little bit, prevent him from making those same mistakes, and we're only going to see more exposure as we get to November, too, so it should be interesting to see how it develops between now and then. We should see a little bit more of the Biden campaign. But Jennifer Franco, I appreciate you joining us tonight. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.